Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that sounds way more epic than it's probably going to end up being. We're talking about Viking shield maidens. You know, those warrior women you've seen in every historical drama for the past decade. The ones with the perfect braids and the dramatic eye makeup that definitely didn't exist yet. But here's the thing, we're not talking about the fighting part. We're talking about what happened after. What happened to these women if they actually survived? Because nobody really tells that story, do they? It's all charging into battle and looking cool, but what about Tuesday morning 10 years later? So, grab your favorite blanket, dim those lights, and settle in. This is going to be a long one, and honestly, it's going to get a bit weird and a bit sad, because that's just how history works. Let's start with the most annoying part. We don't actually know if shield maidens were a real common thing. I know. Disappointing right out of the gate. But stick with me, because what we do know is still pretty interesting, even if it's not quite what the TV shows promised you. The whole concept of the shield maiden comes mostly from the sagas. You know, those Icelandic stories written down a couple hundred years after the Viking Age actually ended. Which is kind of like your great-great-grandkid writing your biography based on family rumors and that one time someone said you did something cool at a party. The accuracy is, let's say, flexible. But here's where it gets interesting. In 2017, scientists finally got around to properly testing the DNA of a skeleton that had been sitting in a museum since the 1800s. This skeleton was found in Birka, Sweden, buried in a proper warrior's tomb. Weapons, armor, strategy game pieces, 2 horses, the whole deal. Everyone just assumed it was a man because, well, weapons meant man, obviously. Except when they tested the DNA, surprise, female. Completely unambiguously female. Of course, this caused an absolute meltdown in certain archaeological circles, because why wouldn't it? People got very upset about a skeleton, a 1,000-year-old skeleton. Some argued maybe she was just buried with her husband's stuff, which, okay, but where's the husband then? Others suggested maybe she was just a really important lady who liked collecting swords, like some kind of Viking Age antique enthusiast. But the skeleton showed signs of a life spent riding horses and possibly engaging in physical conflict, so probably not just a hobby collector. The point is, we've got at least one confirmed example of a woman buried as a warrior in the Viking Age, which means it was possible. Whether it was common, rare, or somewhere in between, we just don't know. But it happened at least once, and that's enough to work with. Now, the sagas mention shield maidens here and there, usually in passing. They've got names like Freydis, Eric's daughter, who was the daughter of Eric the Red. Yes, that Eric the Red, the guy who named Greenland in what might be history's earliest example of false advertising. Freydis shows up in the sagas about Vinland, the Norse settlement in North America, and she's described as, well, intense. In one story, she's pregnant and still grabs a sword to scare off some indigenous attackers when the Norse men are retreating. She allegedly slapped the flat of the blade against her chest and yelled at everyone, and the attackers decided this crazy pregnant lady wasn't worth the trouble and left. In another version of events, she's straight up ruthless, manipulating her way into getting her business partners eliminated and doing some of the work herself. So Freydis is sort of the poster child for women in the Viking Age could absolutely be terrifying. But here's the thing about Freydis. The sagas don't really tell us what happened to her after. She goes back to Greenland, and then nothing. She just fades out of the story, which is actually pretty typical. See, the sagas loved a dramatic moment, a big scene, a heroic last stand, or a clever revenge plot. But, and then she lived quietly for 30 more years and died of old age, doesn't make for a great story, does it? So that stuff gets left out. Which means for us, trying to figure out what happened to warrior women who survived, we're kind of working in the dark. But let's think about it logically.
Let's say you're a woman in the Viking Age Scandinavia, and for whatever reason, you ended up fighting in battles. Maybe you were defending your home when the men were away. Maybe you were part of a raiding crew. Maybe you were one of those rare individuals who just decided the whole stay home and weave thing wasn't for you, and you had the physical ability and social circumstance to make that choice. However it happened, you fought, and you survived. Now what? Well, first off, you're probably injured. Not definitely, but probably. Combat in the Viking Age wasn't like a movie where the hero walks away with one photogenic cut on their cheekbone. It was messy. Broken bones, deep cuts, infections, lost teeth, smashed noses. Even if you won, even if you survived, your body kept the receipts. And medicine in the 9th or 10th century was, okay, it existed, but it wasn't great. The Vikings actually had some pretty decent wound care for the time. They understood the importance of cleaning injuries, used various herbs that actually had antibacterial properties, and had a working knowledge of setting bones. But there was no concept of germ theory, no antibiotics, no anesthesia beyond, here, drink this whole horn of mead and bite down on this stick.
So if you survived a battle, you probably spent the next few weeks or months recovering, assuming you didn't die of infection, which was always a fun possibility. And during that time, you'd be dependent on your community. Because here's the thing about the Viking Age that often gets left out of the dramatic retellings. It was a fundamentally communal society. You couldn't really go it alone. You needed your family, your clan, your settlement, especially if you were laid up with a sword wound that wouldn't quite heal right. This brings us to the question of how these women fit into society in the first place. Because Viking Age Scandinavia was definitely a patriarchal society. Let's not romanticize it too much. Men held most of the formal power. Inheritance usually went through male lines, and women's roles were generally centered around the household. But, and this is important, it wasn't as rigid as medieval Europe would later become. Women in the Viking Age could own property. They could inherit land. They could divorce their husbands, which was actually shockingly progressive for the time. If a woman's husband was off raiding or trading for years at a time, which was common, she ran the entire household and farm. She made economic decisions, managed slaves and workers, represented the family in local dealings. So there was flexibility. There was room for women to hold real power and authority, just usually in specific contexts. The idea of a woman picking up a weapon and fighting was definitely outside the norm, but it wasn't completely incomprehensible to the culture. The sagas mention it without too much shock and awe. It's presented as unusual, yes, but not impossible or unnatural. So let's say our hypothetical shield maiden has recovered from her injuries. What now? Does she just go back to fighting? Does she retire? Does she settle down? And if so, what does that even look like? Here's where we have to speculate a bit, based on what we know about Viking Age society and the occasional hints from sagas and other sources. If a woman fought and gained a reputation for it, that reputation wouldn't just vanish. Reputation was everything in Norse culture. Your name, your deeds, your honor, that was your social currency. So a woman known as a warrior would carry that identity forward, for better or worse. In some cases, that might have been an advantage. Respect, maybe even fear. A certain authority that came from having proven yourself in the most extreme circumstances. If you survived multiple encounters, if you were skilled and lucky enough to keep living when others didn't, that meant something. The Vikings had a complicated relationship with fate and luck. They believed in weird, this concept of personal fate or destiny. If you survived when you probably shouldn't have,
Well, clearly the fates favored you. That gave you a kind of spiritual credibility.
But it also might have made you weird, an outsider, someone who didn't quite fit into the normal social categories. And humans, across all cultures and time periods, tend to be uncomfortable with people who don't fit neatly into boxes. The Vikings were no exception. There's a saga character named Hervor who illustrates this tension beautifully. She's the daughter of a famous warrior, and when she grows up, she decides she's not interested in the traditional women's work. She dresses in men's clothing, takes a male name, and goes off to live as a warrior. She eventually retrieves her father's legendary sword from his burial mound, which is a whole thing involving ghosts and curses, because of course it is. But here's the interesting part. Later in her story, she gives up the warrior life, marries, and has children. The saga doesn't make a big deal about this transition. It just happens. One day she's a feared warrior, the next she's a wife and mother. And apparently, both are just parts of her life. Now, Hervor is a legendary figure, not a historical one. Her story is probably mostly fiction. But the fact that the saga presents this arc, warrior woman to wife and mother, as something that could happen, suggests it fit within the Norse understanding of how lives could unfold. It wasn't seen as contradictory or impossible. You could be multiple things across your lifetime. So maybe that was one path. Fight while you were young and able, then transition into a more traditional role as you aged. Get married, have children, manage a household. Use the reputation and possibly wealth you'd gained as a warrior to secure a good marriage alliance. Because marriage in the Viking Age was largely about alliances and economics. Love might happen, but it wasn't the primary goal. If you came to the marriage with your own wealth, your own reputation, your own battle scars and stories, you'd be negotiating from a position of strength. Your husband wouldn't be doing you a favor by marrying you. It would be a partnership of equals or close to it. Of course, that assumes you wanted to get married. Not everyone did, and while it was definitely expected, there seem to have been exceptions. Wealthy women, particularly widows, sometimes chose to remain unmarried and manage their own estates. If you'd been a warrior, if you'd accumulated your own resources, you might have had that option. Just run your farm, manage your people, live your life. Show up at the local assembly to handle legal matters, make sacrifices at the temple or sacred site, arrange marriages for your nieces and nephews. A quiet life, by Viking standards, which still probably involved a fair amount of hard work and the occasional dispute with neighbors, but at least nobody was trying to split your skull open.
Then there's the question of injuries, which we touched on but really need to dig into. Because surviving a battle didn't mean walking away unscathed. It meant living with whatever damage you took. And in a society without modern medicine, that could mean a lot of things, none of them particularly fun. Let's say you took a blow to the leg. Sword, axe, whatever. It healed, eventually, but not quite right. Now you walk with a limp. In a farming society where physical labor was essential for survival, that's not just an inconvenience. That's a fundamental change in how you move through the world. You can't run the same way, can't work the fields with the same efficiency, can't defend yourself as well if trouble comes again. Your entire physical relationship to your environment has shifted. Or maybe you lost an eye. That happened a lot, apparently. Faces were prime targets, and helmets, while they existed, weren't always worn or weren't always effective. Depth perception goes out the window with one eye. Tasks that require fine visual judgment become harder. And there's the cosmetic aspect too, which we might want to pretend didn't matter, but of course it did.
Humans are visual creatures. We react to how people look. A woman with a missing eye or a face full of scars would be immediately marked as different, as someone with a visible history of trauma. The sagas occasionally mention people with significant disabilities living full lives, which is something, I guess. There's Egil Skallagrimsson's grandfather, who was called the Evening Wolf, because he got so tired and grumpy by evening that he was basically useless. Not exactly a disability, more like extreme fatigue, but the point is the saga mentions it matter-of-factly. People had limitations and they worked around them. Though it's worth noting that most of the disabled people mentioned in sagas are men, and usually men who'd already established their reputations before getting injured. A woman trying to navigate life with serious battle injuries might have had a harder time of it. But maybe she didn't. Maybe her community valued her enough, or feared her enough, or simply accepted her enough that she found her place. We just don't know. The sources are so frustratingly silent on the details. Let's float over to another angle: religion and spirituality. The Vikings had a complex relationship with their gods and with concepts of fate, destiny, and the afterlife. Everyone knows about Valhalla, right? The great hall where warriors who died in battle got to feast and fight forever. It's become this pop culture shorthand for Viking Heaven. But here's something interesting. There was also Folkvanger, the field ruled by the goddess Freya. Half of those who died in battle went there instead. Freya got first pick, actually, and then Odin got the rest for Valhalla.
Freya is a fascinating goddess. She's associated with love, fertility, beauty, but also with war, death, and magic. She rides a chariot pulled by cats, which is an incredible mental image. She owns a cloak made of falcon feathers that lets her fly. She practices Seid, a form of magic that was actually considered kind of inappropriate for men to practice. It was associated with women, with the feminine, and men who practiced it were viewed with suspicion. But Freya, a goddess who encompasses both stereotypically feminine and masculine traits, presides over it. So, if you're a woman warrior, which deity do you identify with? Maybe Freya feels like a natural fit, a goddess who contains multitudes, who doesn't stay in one box. Or maybe you're devoted to Thor, the straightforward protector, god of thunder and farming both. Or maybe Odin, the complicated one, god of wisdom and poetry, but also death and madness. The Vikings didn't really do exclusive worship. You could honor multiple gods for different aspects of your life. But here's the thing about dying in battle and going to Valhalla or Folkvanger. You had to die in battle. If you survived, if you lived to old age and died in your bed, that wasn't your destination. The afterlife for people who died of old age or illness was hell, the realm of the goddess of the same name. And hell wasn't really punishing or tormenting in the Christian sense. It was just kind of gray and boring, apparently. An eternity of just existing without much going on. So, if you're a warrior woman who survived all your battles, you might have this weird tension in your spiritual life. You proved yourself in combat. You did the thing that was supposed to earn you a glorious afterlife. But you survived, which means you don't get that reward. You're going to die eventually of something mundane, and then it's off to the gray lands with everyone else who just lived their lives. Does that feel unfair? Does it change how you view your later years? We don't know, but it's interesting to think about. There's also the social aspect of religious practice. The Vikings didn't have churches or professional priests in the early period. Religious rituals were often family or community affairs, led by local chieftains or other respected individuals. If you were a woman warrior with a reputation, you might be called on to lead certain rituals or sacrifices. That was a form of social power and prestige. It kept you relevant, kept you integrated into the community, even if you weren't actively fighting anymore. Sacrifices in Norse paganism could be animals, could be objects, could be food and drink. The sources also mention human sacrifice, though how common it actually was is debated. The most detailed description comes from an Arab traveler named Ibn Fadlan, who witnessed a ship burial on the Volga River in 922. He described the sacrifice of a slave woman as part of a chieftain's funeral rites, and it's deeply disturbing and probably not great bedtime material, so we'll just acknowledge it happened and move on. The point is, religious practice involved real, sometimes intense rituals, and participating in those was a way to maintain status in the community. Now let's talk about the economics of being a surviving warrior woman, because everything in the Viking Age came back to resources eventually. Who owned what? Who controlled what? Who could feed themselves and their dependents?
If you went raiding or fought in wars, there was potential for profit. Raiding wasn't just random attacking for the fun of it, despite what the medieval chroniclers written by terrified monks might suggest. It was economic. You went, you took valuables, you came back and distributed the wealth. A successful raider could come home with silver, gold, fine cloth, weapons, slaves, all sorts of valuable goods. Even if you were a woman, if you participated, you'd get a share. That was how it worked. Everyone who went got a cut based on their contribution and status. So let's say you went on a few successful raids in your youth. You came back with arm rings of silver, maybe some Frankish coins, a really nice sword, some bolts of silk. That's capital. That's wealth you can use. You can trade it. You can display it to show your status. You can use it to buy land or livestock. You can loan it out and charge interest. Yes, the Vikings had lending and interest. They were surprisingly sophisticated economically. With that wealth, you could establish yourself as an independent landholder, buy a farmstead, stock it with animals, get some workers or slaves to help run it. Now you're a landowner. That makes you a participant in the local assembly, the thing. You have legal standing. You can bring cases and testify. You're a full member of society in a way that matters. And if you're a landowner, you're also potentially a marriage prospect for someone looking to alliance with you, or you're in a position to arrange marriages for your dependents and use those to build networks of obligation and support. The whole society ran on these interlocking networks of kinship and alliance. You helped your relatives, they helped you. You married your daughter to that guy's son, now your families are linked and you support each other. It was all very strategic. But here's the thing about being a woman landowner with a warrior past. You're probably the subject of some really interesting gossip. The Vikings loved gossip. The sagas are full of it. Reputation was built and destroyed by what people said about you. And a woman who'd fought in battles, who'd killed people, yes, let's be clear, that's what warriors did. That's a topic of conversation. Some of that talk might be admiring. Oh, you don't want to cross her. She once cut down 3 men in a raid on Phrygia or whatever. That's social capital. That's a reputation that makes people think twice before trying to cheat you in a land deal or steal your cattle. But some of it might be unsettling to people. There's a concept in the sagas of being arg, which is complicated to translate, but basically means unmanly, cowardly, or sexually suspect. It was a serious insult, one of the worst things you could call a man. If someone called you arg, you were basically obligated to challenge them to a duel or seek legal satisfaction, because letting it stand was unthinkable. But the concept had this weird gender-bending aspect to it. It was associated with taking the receptive role in sex, but also with practicing certain kinds of magic and with behaving in ways considered feminine.
So, what happens when a woman does stereotypically masculine things? Is there a female equivalent of Arger? Not exactly, but there was definitely cultural anxiety about women who stepped outside their prescribed roles. A woman who practiced Sade magic was respected, but also kind of feared and distrusted. A woman who wore men's clothing appears in the sagas sometimes, and it's always remarked upon. Cross-dressing was actually grounds for divorce, technically, for both men and women. If your spouse started wearing the wrong gender's clothes, you could legally end the marriage, which tells you it happened enough that there needed to be a law about it. So, a warrior woman is in this ambiguous space. She's done something that commands respect, something that requires courage and skill, but she's also crossed a gender line, and that makes people uncomfortable. How that plays out probably depended a lot on the individual, her family, her community, and how she navigated it all. Maybe she leaned into it, kept dressing in a practical, masculine way, kept her weapons close, maintained that fierce reputation, and used it as armor against anyone who might challenge her. Or maybe she deliberately softened her image as she aged, adopted more traditionally feminine dress and activities, became known as a skilled weaver or a generous host, showed that she could be both, that containing multitudes was possible. There's actually some interesting archaeological evidence about gender and clothing. Grave goods tell us a lot about how people were buried, and presumably how they were viewed. The typical woman's grave includes things like brooches, beads, weaving tools, household items. The typical man's grave includes weapons, tools for metalworking or carpentry, gaming pieces. But there are outlier graves, graves with mixed goods. That woman warrior grave in Birka we mentioned earlier had clearly masculine-coded grave goods, weapons, armor, strategy games, but she was still buried as an individual worthy of respect and honor. She got the full warrior send-off. There are other graves with more subtle mixing. A woman buried with mostly feminine items, but also a single weapon. A man buried with mostly masculine items, but also weaving tablets. What does that mean? Were these people who moved between roles, people who didn't fit neatly into the categories, or were the grave goods chosen by survivors to reflect a complicated life? We don't know, but it suggests that the rigid gender categories we might imagine didn't always apply neatly. There was slippage, there was flexibility, even if it was limited and probably uncomfortable for the people living it. Let's get back to our shield maiden, living her post-battle life. She's older now. Maybe she's in her 40s or 50s, which is actually pretty old for the Viking Age. Life expectancy was rough. Childbirth took many women. Injuries and infections took many men. Hard labor wore everyone down. If you made it to 50, you were a survivor in multiple senses.
Your fighting days are definitely behind you. Even if you wanted to keep going, the body doesn't cooperate forever. Joints ache. Old injuries flare up when the weather changes. You're slower, tire more easily. That's just aging, especially aging after a physically punishing youth. So what's your role now? In Norse society, elders had a particular kind of authority. You were valued for your experience, your memory, your wisdom. You remembered how things were done, how disputes were settled in the past, who was related to whom. You were a living repository of history and law. The Vikings didn't write things down much. They had runes, but those were mainly for short inscriptions. Most knowledge was oral, passed down through memory and teaching. So old people who remembered things were genuinely important. If you were an older woman who'd lived an unusual life, you had stories, and stories mattered. The Vikings loved stories. The long winter nights had to be filled with something, and that something was often storytelling. Sagas, poems, histories, all shared aloud. If you could tell a good story about your raiding days, about battles you'd seen, about places you'd traveled, you were entertainment and education both. You might also be a source of practical knowledge. You know how to treat wounds because you've had plenty of your own.
You know how to maintain weapons and armor. You know tactics, strategy, how to read a developing situation. If the community is under threat, even if you can't fight anymore, you can advise, you can help plan defenses, you can teach younger people what you know. And if you had children, either your own or fostered, fostering was huge in Norse society. Kids were often sent to be raised by relatives or allies as a way of building bonds. You're passing on your knowledge to them. Maybe your daughter isn't interested in fighting, but she's fierce in other ways, and you've taught her not to back down. Maybe your son is a warrior, and you've given him lessons no other mother could. Or maybe you've taught your foster son's wife how to defend the farmstead when the men are away, because you know how important that is. There's a saga about a woman named Aud the Deep-Minded, and while she's not described as a warrior, her story is relevant. After her husband and son died, she commissioned a ship, loaded it up with her female relatives and dependents, and sailed from Scotland to Iceland to start a new life. She claimed land, distributed it to her followers, arranged marriages, and basically founded a whole new community. She was remembered as wise and commanding, someone who shaped the settlement of Iceland, and she did all this as a widow, without a man leading or directing her.
The point is, women could have real power in Norse society, especially later in life when they'd accumulated experience, wisdom, and wealth. A former shield maiden would fit into that tradition, maybe even more so because she'd have that additional layer of respect from having proven herself in the most extreme circumstances. But let's not romanticize it too much, because it was also probably lonely sometimes. If you were one of the only women in your region who'd lived that kind of life, who else could you talk to about it? Who else understood what it was like to face someone trying to end your life and to fight back and to survive? Warriors had their own culture, their own understanding. Men who'd fought together had bonds, shared experiences. If you were a woman, you were probably on the outside of that, or only partially included. And there's the trauma aspect, which nobody in the Viking Age had language for, but definitely existed. We call it PTSD now. They didn't have a term for it. But the symptoms, nightmares, heightened alertness, difficulty connecting with others, sudden flashbacks triggered by sounds or smells, those are human responses to trauma, not modern inventions. If you'd been in battles, if you'd seen people die, if you'd killed people yourself, that left marks, internal ones, harder to see than a scar, but just as real. The sagas occasionally hint at this. There are warriors who become moody, withdrawn, prone to sudden rages. There are people who can't settle, who keep going off on new voyages and raids because they can't stand staying still. There's even a category of warrior called berserkir, the berserkers, who fought in a kind of trance state and were considered dangerous and unpredictable even outside of battle. That might have been ritual behavior, might have been drugs, might have been something psychological, probably a mix. But the point is, the Vikings recognized that some warriors were affected by their experiences in ways that made them hard to be around. If you were a woman dealing with that kind of aftermath, how would you cope? Your community might be sympathetic to a point, but there were limits. Everyone had hard lives. Everyone dealt with loss and pain. You were expected to be tough, to endure. Complaining was weakness. Breaking down was shameful. Maybe you threw yourself into work, ran your farm with fierce efficiency, kept yourself busy from dawn to dusk so you didn't have time to think. Maybe you drank, which was socially acceptable and extremely common. Alcohol shows up constantly in the sagas. Feasts, rituals, social gatherings all involved copious drinking. If you were using it to numb old pain, well, who would even notice? Or maybe you found meaning in other ways, became deeply involved in religious practice, made pilgrimages to sacred sites, commissioned rune stones to commemorate the dead, gave generously to those in need,
building a reputation for honor and charity, tried to balance out the scales somehow. This is getting pretty heavy for a sleep video, so let's bring it back a bit. Let's talk about something more concrete. Clothing. What did a former shield maiden wear?
In battle, assuming you fought, you probably wore practical clothing. Trousers, maybe, which women didn't typically wear, but which make way more sense if you're fighting or riding. A tunic, possibly a mail shirt if you were wealthy or important enough. A helmet if you were lucky. But day to day, after your fighting days, what then? The typical Norse woman's outfit was a long underdress, usually linen, with a woolen overdress on top. The overdress was held up by a pair of large brooches at the shoulders, and often had strings of beads stretched between them. More beads meant more wealth. You might also wear arm rings, neck rings, finger rings if you had them. All of that was both decoration and portable wealth. Silver you could wear showed your status, and in a pinch you could trade it. So do you dress like that, like every other respectable woman, or do you keep elements of your warrior days? Maybe you wear a more practical version, shorter dress for easier movement. Maybe you keep your weapons nearby, a knife at your belt always, a sword hung on the wall within reach. Maybe you never quite give up the trousers, wear them under your dress or when you're working. Small acts of maintaining your identity, even as you outwardly conform. Or maybe you go full traditional. Embrace the feminine presentation completely, but with an edge. The richest cloth, the most jewelry, everything to broadcast that you're not just any woman. You're someone who earned this wealth, this status. You're choosing to dress this way from a position of power, not because you have no other option. Presentation is always political. How you dress, how you carry yourself, how you speak. It signals to others who you are and how you want to be treated. A former warrior would be acutely aware of that, probably. She'd know the value of reputation and image. Let's talk about marriage again, because we touched on it, but there's more to explore. If you were a shield maiden who survived and eventually married, what would that relationship look like? Marriage in the Viking Age was a negotiated arrangement between families. The bride's family provided a dowry. The groom's family provided a bride price. There were witnesses, contracts, legal formalities. It was serious business. But once you were actually married and living together, the day-to-day reality varied enormously depending on the people involved.
If you married someone who respected your past, who saw your warrior experience as an asset, that could work well. He knows you can defend the household when he's away. He knows you're not someone to cross. There's probably mutual respect there, maybe even equality in a way that was unusual for the time. You manage the farm together, make decisions together, present a united front to the world. But if you married someone who was threatened by your past, or who wanted you to pretend it never happened, that's a recipe for tension. Maybe he makes comments. Maybe he expects you to be meek and deferential now, to perform a femininity you never fully inhabited. Maybe there are arguments, resentments building over years. And then there's childbirth, which we haven't really touched on yet. If you had children, whether within marriage or outside of it, and the Vikings were more flexible about that than later Christian societies, that was a huge risk. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women. You could survive multiple battles and then die bringing a baby into the world. The irony would be almost funny if it weren't so grim. If you survived childbirth, and many women did, you then had the work of raising children,
and that was its own kind of battle, honestly. Keeping them fed, clothed, healthy in a world without modern medicine, teaching them everything they needed to know to survive and thrive, protecting them from all the dangers of the world. Maybe being a mother felt like a natural extension of being a warrior. Different methods, same fierce protectiveness. Or maybe it felt completely alien, this vulnerability that came with loving someone so much. Your children are soft targets, hostages to fortune. You can't fight off illness or accident or fate. Some women must have chosen not to have children if they could manage it. The Norse had some knowledge of herbal contraceptives and abortifacients. It wasn't reliable, but it existed. If you didn't want to risk childbirth or didn't want the tie of children, you might try to avoid it, though that would be going against massive social pressure. Women were expected to have children. It was one of your primary functions in society's eyes. But let's say you made it through. You fought, you survived, you maybe married or maybe didn't. You maybe had children or maybe didn't. And now you're old. Genuinely old. 60, 70 if you're incredibly lucky. What's the end of your story? In the best case, you're surrounded by family. Children, grandchildren, maybe even great-grandchildren. You're the matriarch, the elder, the one everyone comes to for advice and judgment. You sit in the place of honor at feasts. Your words carry weight. When you die, you're mourned properly, buried with respect, maybe with some of your old weapons, a nod to who you were. Maybe a rune stone is raised in your memory, your deeds remembered and celebrated.
The harder version is that you're alone. Maybe your children died, which happened a lot. Maybe you outlived your entire family. Maybe you ended up dependent on distant relatives who see you as a burden. You're just another mouth to feed, another old woman taking up space. Or maybe you're still independent, but isolated, living on your farmstead with just a few servants or slaves, respected but not loved, feared but not understood, the weird old woman with the scars and the stories kept at arm's length. How you're remembered depends on so many factors: who survives you, who tells your story, whether anyone bothers to write it down or carve it in stone. Most people weren't remembered. They lived, they died, they vanished into history's silence. Only the exceptional got commemorated, and even then, only if they had family with resources and motivation to do it. If you were very lucky, you made it into a saga. Your deeds got woven into story, retold for generations. You became one of those names we still know: Freydis, Lagertha, Hervor. Half history, half legend, impossible to fully separate one from the other, but at least remembered. If you weren't lucky, you're just gone. An unnamed woman in an unnamed grave. Or maybe not even that. Maybe you were buried at sea or cremated with your ashes scattered. Nothing left but bones, and eventually not even that. It's strange to think about, honestly. All these lives, all these individual experiences, women who picked up weapons for whatever reason, who fought and survived, who then had to figure out how to live with what they'd done and seen. Each one was a complete person with thoughts and feelings and relationships and daily annoyances and moments of joy, and almost all of it is just lost.
What we have are fragments. A skeleton with weapons. A few lines in a saga. A reference in someone else's story. From these scraps, we try to reconstruct entire lives, entire possibilities. It's like trying to see a whole picture when you only have 3 pieces of a 1,000-piece puzzle. But maybe that's okay. Maybe the point isn't to know exactly what happened, but to acknowledge that it did happen, that these women existed, that they made choices, that they mattered. Even if we can't name them all or tell their stories completely, we can make space for them in our understanding of history. We can push back against the assumption that women were always passive, always in the background. We can say, here is evidence that some women fought, and here's what we think might have happened to them after. And we can recognize that their experiences were probably complicated. Not a simple heroic narrative, not a tragedy, just complicated, like most lives, a mix of triumph and loss, strength and vulnerability, freedom and constraint. They navigated a world that didn't quite have a script for them, and they did their best. Some probably thrived. Some probably struggled. Most probably fell somewhere in between, having good days and bad days, good years and bad years, making it work as best they could with what they had.
So let's drift into the legal side of things for a bit, because the Vikings were surprisingly obsessed with law, like really obsessed. They didn't have a unified government or a king with absolute power, at least not in the early Viking Age. What they had were things, these local and regional assemblies where free men, and this is important, gathered to settle disputes, make decisions, and conduct legal business. The thing was part court, part legislature, part social gathering. Everyone who was anyone showed up. You aired your grievances, you brought witnesses, you argued your case. There were complex procedures and rules. Some disputes were settled with compensation payments, carefully calculated based on the severity of the offense and the status of the people involved. Other disputes ended in outlawry, where someone was declared outside the law's protection and could be harmed with no legal consequences. And some disputes, if they couldn't be resolved, ended in holmgang, a formal duel, though that got banned eventually in Iceland, because apparently too many people were using it to just legally eliminate rivals, which kind of defeated the purpose. Women could attend the thing. They could bring cases, especially in matters concerning property or inheritance. They could testify as witnesses, though their testimony might be weighted differently than a man's depending on the region and situation. But they were participants in the legal system, not completely excluded from it. So if you were a former shield maiden with property and status, you'd be at the thing. You'd be involved in the community's decision-making. And here's where your reputation would really matter. When you spoke, did people listen? Did your opinion carry weight? If you had a history as a warrior, if people knew you'd proven yourself, that probably helped. You weren't just some woman with ideas. You were someone who'd seen things, done things, survived things. Your judgment might be valued for that. But you'd also have to be careful. The thing was a social minefield. Insults and accusations flew. Honor was constantly being negotiated and defended. If someone disrespected you, you had to respond, or you'd lose face. And the responses available to you were, well, they were different than they'd be for a man. A man could challenge someone to holmgang directly. A woman doing that would be very strange. Not impossible, maybe, but definitely outside the norm. More likely, you'd have to be strategic. Use your network of male relatives to apply pressure. Bring a formal legal case. Use your words to cut someone down in front of the assembly, publicly shaming them. The Vikings were actually really into verbal sparring. Flighting, they called it. These ritualized insult contests. Some of the insults recorded in the sagas are genuinely creative. Very crude, but creative.
If you were good with words, that was a weapon all its own.
There's a whole section in the sagas about a woman named Bergthora who gets into an extended feud with a man named Hallgerd. They never directly confront each other in single combat, but they keep arranging for each other's servants and followers to be taken out. It's this slow-burning, passive-aggressive conflict that escalates over years. Both women are using the tools available to them: social manipulation, economic pressure, strategic marriages and alliances. It's frankly more sophisticated than just hitting each other with swords, even if it's also kind of petty and ultimately ends badly for everyone involved. The point is, a woman with intelligence and social skills could wield real power. Add in a warrior reputation, and you're playing on a different level. People might think twice before crossing you, knowing that you understand violence in a way most women don't. Even if you're not going to personally show up and start swinging a sword, you're too old for that now. The implication is there. You know people. You have connections. You're not someone to underestimate. Let's talk about skills and teaching for a bit, because if you survived as a warrior, you accumulated very specific knowledge, and knowledge in a largely oral culture was valuable. First, weapons skills. Even if you're not fighting anymore, you know how to use a sword, an axe, a spear, a bow. You know maintenance, how to sharpen a blade, repair damage, care for a shield. You know what makes a good weapon versus a mediocre one. If you have sons, nephews, foster sons, you can teach them, and your teaching would be practical, based on real experience, not just theory. But also, you know tactics. You understand how a fight develops, how to read terrain and use it, how to tell when someone's about to break and run versus when they're committed, how to spot an ambush, how to organize a defense. This was military knowledge, and while the Vikings didn't have formal military academies, they absolutely valued experienced warriors who could pass on their expertise. If your community faced threats, and most communities did, whether from raiders, rival clans, or just opportunistic thieves, you could be involved in planning defenses, where to position people, how to fortify the farmstead, what to do if you're outnumbered, when to fight, and when to negotiate or flee. This stuff saved lives.
You might also know field medicine, how to treat wounds in the moment before infection sets in, which herbs to pack into a cut to slow bleeding, how to set a broken bone, more or less, how to tell when someone's going to make it versus when they're already gone and you shouldn't waste resources trying to save them. It's grim knowledge, but practical. And you'd know about endurance, how to keep moving when you're exhausted, how to ration food and water, how to sleep lightly and wake at the slightest sound, how to manage fear so it doesn't paralyze you. These are psychological skills as much as physical ones, and they transfer to all sorts of situations. A hard winter when supplies are running low, you know how to handle scarcity. A dangerous journey, you know how to stay alert. A crisis in the community, you know how to keep your head. All of this makes you valuable, not in the same way you were valuable as an active fighter, but valuable nonetheless. You're a resource, a teacher, someone who makes the community stronger and more resilient. Now let's float over to relationships with other women, because that's something we haven't really dug into yet. If you were a shield maiden, how did other women relate to you? Some probably admired you, saw you as someone who broke boundaries, who did something extraordinary. Maybe younger women looked up to you, asked you questions, wanted to hear your stories. Maybe some of them even wanted to follow your path, and maybe you encouraged that, or maybe you discouraged it, depending on your own feelings about the life you'd lived.
But others probably found you threatening or off-putting. You violated the normal categories. You did things women weren't supposed to do. And for women who'd stayed firmly within traditional roles, who'd done everything society expected of them, your existence might have felt like an implicit criticism, like you were saying their choices, their lives, weren't good enough.
There could be jealousy, too. If you had wealth from raiding, if you had status and independence, other women might resent that, especially if they were stuck in difficult marriages or struggling economically. Why should you get to be free and powerful when they don't? Or there could be pity. Look at her. Poor thing, never learned proper women's work, probably couldn't get a husband the normal way, had to go around fighting like a man to get any respect. What a sad, strange life. People are complicated. Some women probably felt multiple contradictory things about you simultaneously, respected your courage but thought you were weird, envied your freedom but were glad they didn't have your scars, found you fascinating but didn't actually want to be your friend. And then there were the practical relationships. If you were a landowner, you employed people, servants, slaves, workers. Some of them were women. How did that power dynamic work? Were you a fair mistress or a harsh one? Did you treat the women working for you with more understanding because you knew what it was like to be underestimated? Or were you harder on them because you expected everyone to be as tough as you? Slavery is something we need to acknowledge here, even though it's uncomfortable. The Vikings absolutely practiced slavery. Thralls, they called them. People captured in raids or born into slavery. They did the hardest, worst work. They had no legal rights. They could be bought, sold, inherited, or freed if their owner chose. It was a brutal system. If you went on raids, you were probably involved in taking captives. That's part of what raiding was, capturing people to sell or keep as labor. How do you live with that later? How do you relate to the thrall women working in your household, knowing you might have once been on the other side of that equation, the one doing the capturing? Maybe you were kind to them, relatively speaking, didn't use physical punishment, gave them enough food, eventually freed some of them. Or maybe you weren't. Maybe you were harsh because you could be, because they were property and you were the owner, and that's just how the world worked.
The sagas don't really delve into the psychological complexity of this stuff. Slavery is just a background fact, barely remarked upon, but it was real, and it shaped lives and relationships in profound ways. Let's shift to something slightly less heavy: daily routines. What did a former shield maiden actually do all day in her later years? If you owned a farm, your day started early, dawn or before. Animals needed tending: cows, sheep, goats, horses, chickens, pigs. They needed feeding, milking, mucking out. Someone had to do it, and even if you had workers, you were probably involved in supervising, if not doing it yourself. Then there was food preparation. In a world without refrigeration or grocery stores, this was a constant, labor-intensive task. Grinding grain into flour, baking bread, churning butter, making cheese, preserving meat and fish through salting, smoking, or drying, brewing ale, which was safer to drink than water, and which everyone consumed daily, children included, tending the kitchen garden where you grew vegetables and herbs. Textile work was huge. Everyone needed clothes, and clothes wore out fast with hard use. Wool had to be processed, cleaned, carded, spun into thread, then woven into cloth,
then cut and sewn into garments. This was hours and hours of work. Women often worked in groups, spinning or weaving together, because it was more efficient and less boring. If you were a former warrior who'd never learned these skills properly, that might be awkward. Maybe you were terrible at it, and everyone knew it, and it was this minor, ongoing embarrassment. Or maybe you'd gotten good at it over the years, proved you could master domestic skills just like you'd mastered weapon skills. There was also maintenance of the farm and buildings, repairs to the house, the barn, the fences, preparing firewood for winter, which required cutting and splitting and stacking enormous amounts of wood, managing supplies, knowing what you had and what you needed to trade for.
If it was the trading season, you might travel to a market town, pack up surplus goods, wool, butter, dried fish, whatever you had to sell. Make the journey, which could be dangerous depending on distance and route. Conduct your business, maybe catch up on news and gossip from other regions. Buy what you needed, iron, salt, luxuries if you could afford them. Then make the journey home. Or maybe traders came to you. The Vikings were great travelers. There were people who made their living going from place to place, carrying goods, facilitating exchanges. If a trader showed up at your farm, that was an event, a break in routine, news from elsewhere, new items to examine and consider. As a former warrior, you might have maintained connections with traveling merchants more than most. You'd traveled yourself. You understood the wider world. You might even know some of the traders personally from your raiding days. There could be a kind of camaraderie there, fellow people who'd seen beyond their home communities. The rhythm of the year structured everything. Spring was planting, lambing, calving. Summer was the easiest time, relatively speaking. Long days, warm weather, growing crops. Also the raiding season, when the seas were navigable and young people went off seeking their fortunes. Autumn was harvest, slaughtering animals you couldn't feed through winter, preserving everything possible. Winter was survival mode, staying warm, stretching supplies, waiting for spring. Long, dark months where you were mostly stuck inside. Winter was when the storytelling happened, when the work was done for the day and everyone gathered around the fire. That's when the sagas came out. Stories of gods and heroes, family histories, tales of distant lands. If you had good stories from your warrior days, winter was when you'd tell them. Over and over, probably, polishing them with each retelling until they had the shape and rhythm of saga. You'd tell about the time you raided the Frankish coast and came back with a chest full of silver coins. The time you fought off 3 attackers and lived to laugh about it. The time you sailed through a storm so bad everyone thought they were going to die but somehow made it through. The time you saw the northern lights dancing green and strange across the sky, and someone said it was the Valkyries riding.
Some of it would be true, some of it exaggerated, some of it adapted, details shifted to make a better story. That's how oral tradition works. The truth matters, but so does the telling. And maybe, in those long winter nights, you'd also tell the parts that weren't glorious. The fear, the cold, the hunger, the friends who didn't make it back, the moral weight of things you'd done that seemed necessary at the time but haunted you later. Though, maybe not. Maybe those parts you kept to yourself, locked away where the firelight didn't reach. Let's talk about spirituality and religious practice in more depth, because it mattered a lot in daily life. The Vikings didn't separate the sacred and the secular the way we tend to. Everything was potentially charged with spiritual significance. There were gods, as we mentioned, Odin, Thor, Freya, Freyr, Tyr, Loki, and a whole host of others. But there were also landvættir, land spirits tied to specific places. You had to maintain good relationships with them, or they'd make trouble. There were elves, dwarves, giants, all sorts of supernatural beings that were just part of how the world worked. And there were the dead. Your ancestors were still present in a way. They could be contacted, consulted, honored. Family burial mounds were sacred spaces. You made offerings there, held rituals, maintained connections across the boundary between living and dead. If you were a former warrior, you might have a particularly complicated relationship with the dead. You'd sent people to their deaths. You carried them with you, whether you wanted to or not. Did you make offerings to appease them? Did you dream about them? Did you worry about encountering them in the afterlife?
There were also practices like cider, that magic associated with Freya. It involved trance states, prophecy, manipulating fate and fortune. It was powerful, but also kind of suspect, especially for men. For women, it was more acceptable, though practitioners were still viewed with a mix of respect and unease. If you practiced cider, or if you consulted with someone who did, you were trying to see the threads of weird, of fate, trying to understand what was coming, maybe even influence it. In a world of uncertainty and danger, that was valuable. Knowing whether to plant a particular field, whether to undertake a journey, whether an illness would pass or prove mortal, that kind of knowledge could save lives or fortunes. But it was also deeply weird and transgressive. Cider practitioners, vulvas, were often described as traveling alone, going from community to community offering their services. They were respected, but not quite part of normal society, too strange, too liminal. If you had a warrior past and also practiced cider, you were doubly outside the normal categories, potentially very powerful, but also isolated. Then there's the question of what happened as Christianity spread into Scandinavia. This was a gradual process, happening at different times in different places. Norway and Denmark started converting in the late 900s. Sweden held out longer. Iceland converted officially in the year 1000, though that was more of a political decision than a universal change of heart, and plenty of people kept practicing the old ways in private. If you were a former shield maiden living through this transition period, how did you navigate it? The new religion had very different ideas about women, about violence, about the afterlife. Christianity preached peace, forgiveness, turning the other cheek. It said women should be meek and submissive. It had one afterlife for everyone, not separate destinations based on how you died. Did you convert? Maybe you did, for political or social reasons. Going Christian could mean better trade relationships, alliances with powerful Christian rulers, access to new networks. And the promise of heaven might be appealing, especially if you worried about the weight of your past actions. Christianity offered forgiveness, redemption, a clean slate.
Or maybe you resisted, held on to the old gods because they made more sense to you. Freya understood warriors. Odin understood the complex morality of survival. The old ways had room for someone like you. Why give that up for a religion that wanted to shove you back into a box you'd fought your way out of? More likely, you did what a lot of people did, a bit of both. Hedged your bets, wore a Thor's hammer amulet and a cross both,
made offerings at the old sacred sites, but also attended the new church services, kept your options open, spiritually speaking. The conversion period was messy and complicated and took generations. People didn't just switch belief systems overnight. The old and new blended, coexisted, conflicted, and individuals, especially individuals with unusual life histories, navigated it in their own ways. Let's think about friendship and companionship, because everyone needs connection. If you were a former shield maiden, who were your friends? Maybe other women who'd lived unconventional lives, widows who ran their own estates, merchants who traveled, healers and herb women with specialized knowledge, women who, for whatever reason, didn't quite fit the normal mold. You'd find each other, recognize kindred spirits, build relationships based on mutual understanding. Or maybe your closest friends were men, fellow former warriors who could relate to your experiences in ways other women couldn't. You'd drink together, swap stories, maintain the bonds forged in shared danger. Though those friendships might be complicated by gender dynamics and social expectations.
Or maybe you were close with your family, siblings, cousins, nieces, and nephews. Blood ties were everything in Norse society. Your clan was your safety net, your support system, your identity. Even if they didn't fully understand your choices, they were still your people. But it's also possible you were lonely, that the path you'd walked set you apart in ways you couldn't bridge, that you had acquaintances and allies, but no one who really knew you, not fully. Loneliness was probably common in the Viking Age, honestly. Life was hard, and people died young, and communities were small. Your person, your true friend, might die of illness, or in a raid, or in childbirth, and then you just went on without them. The sagas talk about friendships, sometimes very intense friendships, sworn brothers who were closer than blood relatives. But these are usually male friendships. Female friendships appear in the sagas too, but less often, and usually defined through their relationships to men, co-wives, sisters, mothers, and daughters. Independent female friendship, just two women who chose each other as companions, that's harder to find in the sources. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Just because the saga writers didn't focus on it doesn't mean it didn't exist. Women must have had friendships, companionships, people they relied on and cared for. A former warrior woman probably valued those relationships intensely, knowing from experience how fragile life was and how much you needed people you could trust. Let's drift into the subject of memories and how they shape you. If you lived to old age as a former shield maiden, you carried decades of memories, some vivid, some fading. The human brain does strange things with traumatic memories. Sometimes they're crystal clear, every detail sharp. Sometimes they blur and shift, details changing each time you recall them. You might remember the exact feel of a weapon in your hand, the weight and balance of it, the smell of the sea on a raiding voyage, salt and tar and unwashed bodies, the sound of shield walls clashing, that specific noise of wood on wood and metal on metal and people screaming, the face of someone someone who didn't survive an encounter with you. But you might also misremember, combine different events into one. Forget entire stretches of time. Convince yourself something happened one way when it actually happened another. Memory is unreliable, especially old memory, especially traumatic memory. And you'd probably have recurring dreams, the same scenarios playing out night after night. Trying to fight, but your arms won't move. Trying to run, but your legs are too heavy. Watching someone die again and again. Or maybe good dreams sometimes. Dreams of flying, of freedom, of being young and strong and unbroken. The Vikings took dreams seriously. They were messages, omens, glimpses of weird unfolding. If you dreamed of someone who was dead, they might be trying to communicate with you. If you dreamed about something about to happen, you'd better pay attention. So your dreams weren't just random neurological noise. They meant something. They shaped your understanding of your place in the world, your relationship with the past and future. An old warrior woman with powerful dreams might be seen as having special insight, a connection to the supernatural realm. Or she might be seen as haunted, troubled, someone to pity or avoid. Let's think about the very end, your final days, your death, what came after. If you were lucky, you saw death coming, an illness that gave you time to set your affairs in order. You'd gather your family, distribute your property, speak your final wishes. Maybe you'd be stern about it, all business, making sure everything was handled properly. Or maybe you'd be reflective, sharing wisdom or regrets, saying the things that needed to be said while you still could.
You might ask to be buried in a certain way, with specific items, in a specific place. Maybe you'd want your weapons with you, even if you hadn't used them in decades. They were part of who you were. Or maybe you'd give them away, pass them on to someone worthy, create a legacy that way. The Vikings had various burial practices: inhumation, placing the body in the ground, sometimes in a ship if you were very important and wealthy; cremation, burning the body on a pyre. The ashes might be buried, scattered, or put in an urn. It varied by region, time period, personal preference, family tradition. If you were remembered, if someone cared enough and had resources, they might raise a rune stone. These monuments were surprisingly democratic, not just for kings and jarls, but regular people who mattered to someone. The inscriptions were usually simple. X raised this stone in memory of Y, who was some description of their relationship and perhaps accomplishments. There are rune stones for women, not as many as for men, but they exist. Some specifically mention that the woman commemorated was skilled, wise, honorable. A few mention that she traveled. None that I know of specifically say she was a warrior, but remember, most shield maidens probably don't get identified as such in the archaeological record. They're just women. Unless they happened to be buried with weapons, we'd never know. Your grave, if you had one, might be robbed eventually. Grave robbing was common, unfortunately. People knew that the wealthy were buried with valuable items, and eventually someone would decide those items would be more useful to the living. So even if you were laid to rest with honor, with your weapons and jewelry and grave goods, it might not last. Some stranger might dig you up generations later, take everything valuable, scatter your bones. Or your grave might be forgotten, the marker eroded or lost, the location built over or plowed under. Within a few generations, no one remembers exactly where you were buried, or even that you existed.
That's the fate of most people, honestly. Historical oblivion. You live, you matter intensely to the people around you, and then you die, and the memory fades, and eventually it's like you never were. Only the exceptional get remembered long term, and even then, the version that gets remembered is usually distorted, simplified, made to fit a narrative. So what happened to Viking shield maidens who survived battles? In the end, the same thing that happened to everyone. They aged, they died, they were forgotten by history, save for a few fragments and hints and possibilities. But they lived. That's the important part. They existed as full, complicated human beings. They made choices, they navigated impossible situations, they survived. And then they had to figure out how to keep surviving, how to build lives in a world that didn't quite have a script for them. Some probably lived rich, full lives, found meaning and purpose and connection, died satisfied, at peace with their choices. Others probably struggled, carried wounds, physical and psychological, that never fully healed, died with regrets, with things left undone or unsaid. Most probably fell somewhere in between, had good days and bad days, good years and bad years, did the best they could with what they had, found moments of joy and meaning amid the difficulty, left small marks on the world through the people they taught, the children they raised, the communities they helped sustain. And now, more than 1,000 years later, we're still trying to piece together their stories from fragments, still trying to understand who they were and what their lives meant. We probably won't ever get the full picture. The sources are too limited, the evidence too scattered. But we can acknowledge that they existed. We can make space in our historical imagination for these women who fought and survived and lived and died. We can resist the erasure that comes from assuming that if something isn't documented, it didn't happen. The Viking shield maiden who survived the battle and lived to old age, whoever she was, wherever she was, she mattered. Her life had value. Her story, even if we can never fully know it, deserves to be part of how we understand the past. And on that note, let's let her rest. She earned it. Let's circle back to some specific examples from the sources, because we've been talking in generalities, and it might be nice to get a bit more concrete. Even if these stories are half legend, they still tell us something about how the Norse thought about warrior women and what happened to them. There's Lagertha, probably the most famous shield maiden, though almost everything we know about her comes from one source, a Danish historian named Saxo Grammaticus, writing in the late 1100s, so well after the Viking Age ended. He was writing in Latin, trying to create a grand history of Denmark, and he included a lot of legendary material alongside actual history. Separating one from the other is basically impossible. According to Saxo, Lagertha was a skilled warrior who fought in a battle to avenge a Norwegian king, a guy named Ragnar. Yes, that Ragnar, the semi-legendary one, was so impressed by her courage that he decided he wanted to marry her. But Lagertha, because apparently she wasn't going to make anything easy, put a bear and a dog outside her house to guard it. Ragnar had to get past them to prove himself worthy, which he did because he's Ragnar, and that's how these stories work. So they married, they had children, and then, according to Saxo, Ragnar eventually divorced her to marry someone else, because of course he did. Lagertha didn't just accept this quietly. Later, when Ragnar was in trouble and needed military help, she showed up with a fleet of ships and warriors to support him, saved his life in battle, basically. Then she went home, and according to Saxo, she eventually ended up having her second husband eliminated so she could rule alone. Now, how much of this is true? Probably very little in terms of specific details, but the outline, A woman warrior who married, had children, was divorced, continued to have political and military power. That's a life trajectory. That's someone who moved through different roles over time. And the saga presents it as unusual, but not impossible. Lagertha is respected in the narrative, even admired. She's not punished by the story for being who she is. What happened to her in the end? Saxo doesn't say. She just fades out of the narrative, still ruling her lands, still powerful, which is actually kind of perfect. No tragic death, no comeuppance, just a woman who lived on her own terms and then passed out of recorded history.
Then there's Brynhild, though she's more mythological than historical. She appears in the Volsunga saga and the poetic Edda. She was a warrior woman, one of Odin's choosers of the slain, who got punished for choosing the wrong person to die in battle. Odin put her into an enchanted sleep surrounded by a ring of fire, where she stayed until a hero named Sigurd came along and woke her. They fell in love, swore oaths to each other, and then it all went horribly wrong, because this is Norse mythology, and happy endings weren't really their thing. Through magic and trickery, Sigurd ended up married to someone else, and Brynhild was married to his brother-in-law. When she figured out what had happened, she was devastated and furious. She orchestrated Sigurd's death and then threw herself on his funeral pyre. So that's a pretty different trajectory. Warrior woman to bride to widow to suicide, all driven by betrayal and broken oaths. The story is clearly more about exploring themes of fate, honor, and the consequences of broken promises than it is about realistic life paths. But it tells us that the concept of a warrior woman experiencing profound grief and making extreme choices resonated with Norse audiences. These stories were told and retold because they meant something to people. What's interesting about Brynhild is that even after everything falls apart, she's still portrayed as powerful and dignified. She makes her own choices right up to the end. She's not rescued or saved. She determines her own fate, for better or worse. Let's talk a bit more about the archaeological evidence, because that's where we might find actual women rather than legendary ones. That Birka warrior woman we mentioned earlier, the one whose grave caused such controversy, let's dig into her a bit more. She was buried in the 10th century in a chamber grave, which was a type of burial reserved for high-status individuals. The grave contained a sword, an axe, a spear, a battle knife, 2 shields, and 25 gaming pieces with a gaming board, also 2 horses.
The gaming pieces are particularly interesting. They suggest this person was involved in strategy and tactics, possibly planning military operations. They weren't just a fighter, they were a thinker, a planner, someone who understood warfare at a conceptual level. For over a century, everyone assumed this was a man, because, obviously, the skeleton was labeled as a male warrior in museum records. It was used as an example in studies of Viking Age military hierarchies. And then someone finally tested the DNA and found 2 X chromosomes, no Y chromosome, unambiguously female. The backlash from some quarters was immediate and intense. Arguments that maybe the DNA was contaminated, maybe the bones were mixed up with another burial, maybe she was just buried with someone else's stuff, anything to avoid accepting that a woman was buried as a high-status warrior.
But further analysis confirmed it. This was a woman buried with full warrior honors in a prominent location in Birka's garrison area. She was probably in her 30s when she died. Analysis of her bones suggested a life spent riding horses. Her grave placement and goods suggest she held significant military authority. So what happened to her? Well, she died, obviously. We just don't know how. Battle, illness, accident, old age, could be anything. But before she died, she lived a life important enough that her community buried her with enormous respect and resources. They gave her the send-off of a warrior commander. And then she was forgotten. For over 1,000 years, she lay in that grave and no one knew who she was or what her story had been. She's still nameless. We'll probably never know her name unless some future archaeological discovery turns up a contemporary inscription or record. But we know she existed. We know she was real. And that matters.
There are a few other possible examples. A grave in Nordre Kullen, Norway, contained a woman buried with a sword. A grave in Kaupang, another Norwegian trading town, held a woman with an axe and arrows. These are rarer than male warrior burials, absolutely, but they exist. The question is whether these represent actual warriors or just high-status women buried with symbolic items. And honestly, we might never know for certain. But the Birka woman, at least, seems pretty clearly to have been a real military leader. The totality of the evidence, location, grave goods, physical markers on the skeleton, all points that way. So if she could exist, others could too. Maybe not common, maybe quite rare, but possible, real. Let's think about regional and temporal differences, because the Viking Age spanned about 3 centuries and covered a huge geographic area. Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, the various settlements and colonies scattered across the North Atlantic and into Europe. Things weren't uniform across all that time and space. Early Viking Age versus late Viking Age had differences. The earlier period was more decentralized, more chaotic. Local chieftains held power. Raiding was common and often small scale. This might have been a context where a woman with the inclination and ability to fight could find opportunities to do so. Later, as kingdoms consolidated and Christianity spread, things became more structured, more hierarchical. Kings claimed authority over larger territories. The church brought its ideas about gender roles and appropriate behavior. In this context, a woman warrior would probably face more resistance, more pressure to conform. Geographically, Iceland might have been different from Norway, which was different from Denmark. Iceland was a settler society, a frontier. People went there specifically to get away from the consolidating power of the Norwegian kings. There was more flexibility, more room for unconventional arrangements. A woman warrior might have fit in better there, or at least been tolerated more easily. Norway had rougher terrain, more isolated communities in the fjords and mountains. Small-scale raiding and feuding between valleys was common. In that context, defending your home when the men were away wasn't just possible, it was necessary. A woman who could fight was an asset, not an anomaly. Denmark was flatter, more agricultural, more centralized earlier. Might have been more conservative in terms of gender roles, though that's speculation. And then there were the settlements abroad, the Danelaw in England, the Norse kingdoms in Ireland, the colonies in the North Atlantic. These were places where Norse culture interacted with other cultures, adapted, changed. Who knows what variations emerged in those contexts? The point is, we can't talk about the Vikings as one monolithic culture with one set of rules and practices. There was diversity, and in that diversity, there might have been space for women who didn't fit the standard mold. Let's talk about the gap between legend and reality, because that's really what we've been dancing around this whole time. The legendary shield maidens, Lagertha, Brynhildr, Hervor, they're dramatic, they're life than large. They fit into narratives with clear arcs and meanings. They're characters in stories, crafted to explore themes and entertain audiences. The real women, the ones who might actually have fought and survived, were just people. Messy, complicated, contradictory people living difficult lives in a harsh time. They didn't have narrative arcs. They had days that blended into each other, years that passed without clear shape or meaning. They made small choices that accumulated into lives. And we want them to be heroic. We want them to be empowering symbols. In our current cultural moment, there's a real hunger for historical women who broke barriers, who defied gender expectations, who proved that women have always been capable of anything men could do. Which is fine. That's a valid thing to want. But we have to be careful not to project too much onto these fragmentary figures, not to make them into what we need them to be, rather than trying to understand what they actually were. A woman who fought in the Viking Age wasn't making a feminist statement. She wasn't striking a blow for gender equality. Those concepts didn't exist yet. She was making individual choices in response to specific circumstances within a framework of assumptions and beliefs that were very different from ours. Maybe she fought because her home was attacked and she grabbed a weapon to defend herself and turned out to be good at it. Maybe she fought because her family needed the income from raiding and she was physically capable. Maybe she fought because she genuinely enjoyed it, found meaning and purpose in it. Maybe she fought because she was following the commands of a chieftain or king and didn't really have a choice. And after she survived, she probably didn't think of herself as a trailblazer or a symbol. She thought of herself as someone trying to get by, trying to find a place in her community, trying to survive, trying to make the best life she could with the options available. That's less dramatic than the legendary versions, but it's probably closer to the truth. And there's something valuable in that more grounded understanding. These were real people. They deserve to be understood as such, not just turned into symbols or archetypes.
At the same time, the legends matter too. The fact that Norse culture could imagine warrior women, could tell stories about them without treating them as jokes or impossibilities, that tells us something. It tells us that the conceptual space existed. Women warriors might have been unusual, but they fit within the culture's understanding of how the world could work. Compare that to medieval Christian Europe, where women taking up weapons was almost unthinkable. Joan of Arc, when she appeared, was such an anomaly that the only explanations were divine intervention or demonic possession. There was no cultural framework for a woman warrior that didn't involve supernatural intervention. The Norse had that framework, not a welcoming one, not an easy one, but it existed. And that mattered for the real women trying to live their lives. Let's float into more speculative territory. What would it have felt like emotionally to be a shield maiden who survived? There's probably pride. You did something difficult and dangerous. You proved yourself capable. You survived when others didn't. That has to feel like an accomplishment, even if you don't talk about it much. But there's also probably isolation. You've experienced things most people in your community haven't. You've been to places they haven't seen. You've made choices they've never had to make. That sets you apart. Even people who love you might not fully understand you. There might be guilt. Survivor's guilt is a real thing, across cultures and times. Why did you survive when others didn't? What makes you special? Are you worthy of the life you've been given? These questions probably haunted people, even if they didn't have modern psychological language to articulate them.
There might be anger at the world, at fate, at specific people. Anger at the circumstances that put you in that position in the first place. Anger at the limitations you faced after. Anger at being misunderstood or underestimated. Anger with no clear target, just simmering under the surface. And there's probably love for the people in your life, for the land you live on, for moments of beauty and peace. Love that feels more intense because you know how fragile it all is. You've seen how quickly everything can be destroyed. So when you have something good, you hold it tightly. All of these feelings probably coexisted, shifting and changing over the years. You're not one thing. You're not just the warrior woman. You're a whole person, containing multitudes. The tragedy is that we'll never hear these women speak for themselves. We don't have diaries or letters or autobiographies. We have a few lines in sagas written by other people, usually men, usually generations later. We have silent graves. We have bones and objects that can tell us some things, but not the interior experience, not the feelings and thoughts and dreams. So we do our best. We piece together what we can from the fragments. We try to imagine with empathy and respect. We acknowledge the gaps in our knowledge rather than filling them with convenient assumptions. Let's talk about how these figures have been rediscovered and reinterpreted in modern times, because that's part of their story too. The Viking revival started in the Romantic period, the 1800s, when people got really into medieval and Norse themes. This gave us Wagner's operas, the popularity of Norse mythology, the image of Vikings with horned helmets, which, by the way, they never actually wore, but that's a whole other topic.
Shield maidens appeared in this revival, but they were heavily romanticized, turned into symbols of natural nobility, fierce independence, all very dramatic and removed from anything resembling historical reality. They were fantasy figures, basically. In the 20th century, they got picked up by various movements. Early feminists sometimes pointed to them as evidence that women could be warriors, though often this was done without much historical rigor, just grabbing the image and running with it. More recently, with the explosion of Viking-themed media, movies, TV shows, novels, games, shield maidens are everywhere. Every Viking drama has to have its warrior women, usually with elaborate leather armor and dramatic makeup and impressive fight choreography. Which is fine. Entertainment doesn't have to be historically accurate, but it does shape how people think about history. A lot of people now assume shield maidens were common, that Viking society was almost egalitarian in terms of gender, that women fought alongside men as a regular thing. The reality was almost certainly messier and more constrained, but the legends, both old and new, have taken on a life of their own. And maybe that's okay. Maybe we need these figures,
these symbols of women who fought and survived and refused to be limited. Maybe the emotional truth matters as much as the historical truth. But we should still try to understand the historical truth too. We should still do the hard work of separating evidence from assumption, possibility from certainty. We owe that to the real women who lived these lives.
So, what happened to Viking shield maidens who survived battles? Here's the honest answer. We mostly don't know. We have hints, fragments, possibilities. We have a few archaeological graves. We have saga characters who might be based on real people, or might be entirely fictional. We have cultural context that suggests it was possible, but unusual. The women who actually lived these lives are gone. Their names are mostly forgotten. Their stories are lost. We can't bring them back. We can't give them the recognition and understanding they deserved. But we can acknowledge they existed. We can make space in our historical imagination for the possibility, the probability, that some women in the Viking Age picked up weapons and fought, and that afterward they lived the rest of their lives carrying that experience with them. They aged, they navigated their communities, they found what meaning and purpose they could. They died eventually, as everyone does. And for most of them, that was it. No saga, no stone, no memory. Just a life lived and then ended, like billions of other lives across human history. But a few left traces. A weapon in a grave, a line in a saga, a hint that things were more complicated than we assumed. And from those traces we can build an understanding. Imperfect, incomplete, but something. We can say they were real. Their lives mattered. Their experiences were valid. And even though we can't fully know their stories, we can honor them by trying. By refusing to accept easy answers. By sitting with the uncertainty and the ambiguity. By making room for complexity. The Viking shield maiden who survived the battle isn't one story. She's hundreds of individual stories, almost all lost. She's possibility and absence both. She's history and legend, and the murky space between.
And that's where we'll leave her. In that murky space. That place of shadows and fragments and questions without answers. It's not a satisfying ending, not really, but it's an honest one. She lived. She mattered. She's gone. And we're still here, trying to understand, trying to remember, trying to piece together what remains. That'll have to be enough. So, there we are. The story of what happened to Viking shield maidens who survived battles, told as completely as the sources allow, which is to say, not very completely at all. But we tried. We sat with the fragments and the uncertainties. We imagined with care. We acknowledged what we can't know. And now, on that note, it's probably time to let this one drift off into the quiet. The shield maidens, whoever they were, have rested for 1,000 years or more. They don't need us to wake them. They don't need us to make them into anything they weren't. They just need us to remember that they existed, that they were real, that their lives, however obscure to us now, were as full and complex and meaningful as any life. So let them sleep. Let the stories rest. And maybe,
if you're lucky, you'll sleep too, deep and dreamless, or maybe with dreams of distant times and vanished people. Either way, rest well. The past is gone, the present is quiet, and tomorrow, well, tomorrow will take care of itself. Good night.